The fifth rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, and Josephine Carr read it standing at her kitchen counter with her coffee going cold the way it always went cold when she read things that required her full attention. It was the same letter as the fourth, the same letter as the third. Different dates, slightly different phrasing in the second paragraph. The same conclusion. Meridian Bank regrets that it is unable to extend credit at this time. The reasons cited were consistent across all five: insufficient collateral, business model unproven at scale, projected revenue assumptions not supported by comparable market data. Each reason was stated plainly, as if it were fact, as if it had been determined by a process that was objective and complete. She set the letter down. She picked up her coffee. She looked out the window at the street below, the particular block of the Midtown Financial District, where she had been trying, for 16 months, to close a $30 million acquisition of a commercial real estate portfolio that 3 independent appraisers had valued at $44 million. She had the buyers. She had the sellers. She had the gap analysis, the due diligence, the legal structure, the projected returns. She had everything except the bridge financing that would let the deal close. She had tried to get that financing from Meridian Bank 5 times. She was done with Meridian Bank. Josephine Carr was 53 years old, and she had been in commercial real estate for 26 years, and she had known, from the first rejection, what the rejections were. Not incompetence. The loan officers at Meridian were not incompetent. Not policy. The deals she had brought them had satisfied every stated policy criterion, and she had the documentation to prove it. She had known because she had spent 26 years navigating a field in which the rules applied differently depending on who was applying them, and she had developed, through those years, the specific skill of distinguishing between a door that was locked because of what she was carrying and a door that was locked because of who was carrying it. The Meridian doors were locked because of who. She had come to commercial real estate through the brokerage side. 7 years of learning the field from the floor up, learning what made a deal and what broke one, learning the difference between a building's listed value and what it was actually worth to the right buyer in the right market at the right moment. She had gone to principal transactions in her mid-30s, which was where the real money was and where the barriers were highest. Because principal transactions required capital, and capital required relationships with lenders, and lenders, in commercial real estate, had their own taxonomy of who they preferred to back. She had learned that taxonomy the hard way, not dramatically, not in single incidents she could point to, but in the accumulated experience of a career full of meetings that went a certain way, of deal structures that sailed through for colleagues who were bringing comparable paper, of being the only woman in rooms and the only black person in rooms, and, frequently, the only black woman in any room at all, and watching how that affected the temperature of what happened next. She had not spent her career angry about this. She had spent it paying attention, which was more useful. The 26 years had produced a track record that was, by any fair accounting, exceptional. 72 closed transactions before this one, spanning a range from boutique single-asset deals in her early years to increasingly complex multi-property structures as her practice had grown. She had cultivated a roster of investors who trusted her specifically because she found deals in the complexity that cleaner operators left behind. The situations where the capital structure required real knowledge and the community angles weren't decoration. And the secondary markets that institutional money underserved were, if you understood them, deeply efficient. She had made money for her investors. She had made money for herself. She had a practice that was, on paper, the kind of track record Meridian Bank should have been competing to finance. She had known this since the second rejection. She had documented it since the third. By the fifth, she had a file. Careful, specific. organized with the same precision she brought to her deal structures, that mapped the pattern across all 5 applications, the shifting criteria, the comparable deals approved for other applicants that her applications had been measured against and found wanting by standards that had not been applied to those comparables, the specific language in the rejection letters that migrated between applications, the loan officer who had told her, in a conversation she had noted in writing within an hour of its occurring, that her portfolio was impressive, but that her investor base needed to reflect a more established network. She had asked what established meant. He had looked at her for a moment and said he meant institutional, and she had looked back at him and understood that the conversation was over. The first rejection she had attributed, provisionally, to the deal's complexity. The second she had examined for the specific ways it differed from the first, and had found 2 new criteria that had not appeared in the first letter. The third she had taken to a fair lending consultant she knew from an industry conference, a woman named Rosa Calderon, who had spent 15 years advising borrowers on exactly this kind of pattern. And Rosa had read the 3 letters and the supporting documentation and said, "You have the beginning of something here, but 3 is not enough to be conclusive. Keep going." She had kept going, not because she expected Meridian to change its mind, but because each application added a point to the pattern, and the pattern was what mattered in the end. By the 4th rejection, Rosa had said, "This is enough for a regulatory complaint." By the 5th, she had said, "This is enough for litigation if you want it." Josephine had said, "I want the deal first. Then we'll talk about what comes next." The file was not a lawsuit. Not yet. It was what a careful person built before deciding whether a lawsuit was warranted or whether there was a faster way. Josephine had learned this from her mother, Constance, who had spent 30 years as a labor organizer in Birmingham and who had taught her daughters the difference between 2 kinds of response to injustice. The kind that required the machinery of other people's institutions to produce results, which was slow and uncertain and necessary, and the kind that you produced yourself, which was faster and more reliable and required that you be better prepared than the people who assumed you weren't coming. Her mother had used both kinds her entire career, filing complaints with the NLRB with one hand and building the worker networks that made the complaints unnecessary with the other. And she had taught her daughters not to see them as alternatives, but as concurrent strategies, each moving on its own timeline, both aimed at the same wall. Constance had also taught her daughters something that Josephine had spent 26 years confirming, that the best response to a closed door was not to stand outside it demanding it open, but to build enough that when you came back with documentation of why it had been closed, you were coming from a position that the door had failed to stop. You closed the deal first. Then you dealt with the door. Josephine had the file. She also had a meeting at First Capital Partners the following morning at 9. First Capital Partners occupied the building directly across the street from Meridian Bank. Josephine had looked at that geometry every day for 16 months and had not found it amusing until the 4th rejection, at which point she had begun to find it extremely clarifying. First Capital was smaller than Meridian, a regional commercial lender with a reputation for deals that Meridian's risk appetite found inconvenient, and she had not gone there first because she had a relationship at Meridian that had served her well on 2 previous transactions, and because she had believed, on the first approach, that the relationship would survive the difference in the deal. The relationship had not survived. The difference was not the deal. She had called First Capital on the afternoon of the 5th rejection. She had spoken to a loan officer named David Park, who had listened to a 15-minute summary of the deal structure and asked 4 questions, all of them substantive, none of them about her investor base or the establishment of her network. She had answered the 4 questions. He had said, "Come in tomorrow at 9 and bring the full package." She brought the full package. The full package was substantial, not because Josephine believed in overwhelming lenders with volume, but because this deal's strength was in its architecture, and the architecture required showing. The Community Development Federal Program qualification alone ran 40 pages of documentation, including letters from 3 of the 4 corridor municipalities confirming the underinvestment designation and supporting the preferential financing application. Most lenders, in Josephine's experience, had never processed a deal structured this way, because most lenders had never bothered to learn the program existed. She had budgeted 30 minutes of the meeting to explaining it. David Park did not need the 30 minutes. He had processed one such deal before, he said, 3 years ago in a different market. He asked whether she had accounted for the recapture provision in the event of early refinancing. She had. He asked whether the 3-tier joint venture structure had been reviewed by tax counsel for the specific interaction with the federal qualification. It had. He asked whether the seller's estate had cleared probate on all 11 properties. It had, with documentation attached as Exhibit 7. He spent 2 hours with the package. He asked 14 questions in total. Josephine answered all of them. At the end of the 2 hours, he said he would take it to credit committee on Thursday. He said it the way a person says something that is already mostly decided, not certainly, but with the specific quality of confidence that comes from understanding what is in front of you. Credit committee met Thursday. David called Friday morning. The loan was approved. $30 million. Terms that reflected the deal's actual risk profile, rather than assumptions about its sponsor. Closing timeline aligned with the contract. The commitment letter landed in Josephine's email at 11:47 a.m. on a Friday, and she read it at her kitchen counter, standing up, coffee going cold. The same posture she had been in when she read the 5 rejection letters from Meridian. Because this was how she read important documents, and she was not going to change her habits, because the outcome had changed. The deal closed 6 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, in the offices of Patricia Wynn's firm, which was located, and this was geography rather than design, though Josephine noted it, 2 blocks from the First Capital Partners building, and 4 blocks from Meridian Bank. The closing table had 11 people around it. Josephine sat at the center. She had been at closing tables for 26 years, and she had learned to hold the specific quality of attention that closings required. The final read-through, the places where things could still go wrong, the sequence of signatures that had to land in the right order. She had closed 73 transactions before this one. Each had its own texture. This one had the texture of something that had been a long time building, which was a different quality from the others. Heavier, more specific. Carrying the weight not just of the 16 months, but of the 26 years that had produced someone who could hold a deal together for 16 months and still be sitting at this table when the signatures came. She did not think about Meridian Bank during the signing. She thought about the deal. She always thought about the deal at the table, the parties and their interests, and the structure that was converting all of that into signatures. The 4 properties in underserved corridors that were now going to receive the investment they had been waiting for, the investors whose trust she had held for a decade, and who were about to see it validated in the most concrete possible way. This was the work. This was what the 26 years had been building toward, and what the 16 months had been protecting, and what the 5 rejection letters had tried and failed to stop. Patricia Wynn, who had been on the phone with her at various points through all of it, leaned over during a break in the signing sequence and said, "You held this together a long time." "The deal held itself together," Josephine said. "The deal was always good." Patricia looked at her for a moment. "I know," she said. "That's what I meant." The deal closed at 4:23 p.m. Josephine walked out into a late November afternoon. the specific quality of light that happened when the sun was already low and the city caught it sideways, all the buildings briefly gold. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. 4 blocks down, Meridian Bank's sign was visible, blue on white, familiar from 16 months of looking at it. She looked at it now the way you look at something that has been in your field of vision for so long it has become furniture. She noted it. She was finished with it. She walked to her car. The file she had been building since the 3rd rejection. The documented pattern, the shifting criteria, the comparables, the conversation with the loan officer about the established network. She had sent to a fair lending attorney named Marcus Webb 3 weeks before the closing. Not because the deal required it, but because the pattern required it. Not for her. For the next person who walked into Meridian with good paper and heard the word established used as a direction rather than a description. The attorney had reviewed it and called her on a Wednesday and said it was one of the cleaner fair lending files he had seen in 15 years of practice, and that he intended to pursue it. The investigation opened 6 months after the closing. It was not Josephine's investigation. She had handed the file and stepped back because the deal was done, and the deal was what she had needed to close, and the investigation was what the pattern needed to produce. Rosa Calderon, the fair lending consultant who had been advising her since the 3rd rejection, connected her to Marcus Webb's firm. Marcus had reviewed the file in a single sitting and called her the next morning. Meridian Bank's fair lending practices came under regulatory review the following spring. The review found, across a 3-year period, a pattern of differential treatment in commercial loan applications that correlated with applicant race and gender at a level the regulator's analysis found statistically significant. Josephine's 5 applications were among the 14 they examined in detail. The bank entered a consent agreement that required remedial lending commitments totaling $60 million in targeted commercial loans to previously underserved markets, enhanced fair lending training for all credit committee personnel, and a third-party monitoring program for 5 years. No individual loan officer was named in the public agreement. The pattern had not required individuals. It had only required a culture that produced consistent decisions without anyone needing to articulate a policy. Cultures like that were, in Josephine's experience, both the most durable form of exclusion and the most difficult to name in real time. You could feel it, you could document it. What you couldn't do was point to the person. You pointed to the pattern, which was what the file had always been for. Josephine learned about the consent agreement from a news alert on a Wednesday morning. She was in her car between appointments. A morning call with an investor and an afternoon meeting with a title company for the $62 million deal that was under letter of intent when the notification came through. She pulled over, read the summary carefully, and sat with it for a moment. She thought about the 5 letters. The cold coffee, the loan officer, and the word established, used as a direction rather than a description, aimed at her network as a way of talking about her, without talking about her. She thought about Rosa Calderon at the conference, 15 years of advising borrowers. 3 applications is the beginning. She thought about the $44 million portfolio now performing at 7% above projection. The boring commercial properties with their long-tenured tenants doing exactly what 3 independent appraisers had said they would do. The 4 properties in underserved corridors now receiving the investment they had been waiting for before she came along. She called Marcus Webb from the parking lot. He answered on the 2nd ring. "I saw," she said. "The consent agreement covers 3 years of applications," he said. "There are likely other complainants. The process will run another 2 years at minimum." "That's fine," Josephine said. "That's how it works. You know you won't see anything from this personally." "I know," she said. "That's not what it's for." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Most people don't separate those 2 things. My mother did, Josephine said. She spent 30 years in labor organizing, and she taught me the difference between what you do for yourself and what you do so the next person doesn't have to fight the same thing. A pause. I did the deal. That was for me. This was for the next person. She ended the call. She sat in the parking lot for a moment. In the sideways November light, she had always had her important moments in November, she noted, which was probably coincidence and probably wasn't. And she thought about the $30 million deal that was 4 blocks from a building that had said no 5 times. About David Park's 14 questions, all substantive, about the community development angle on the 4 properties and underserved corridors, and the federal program that most lenders had never bothered to learn, and the preferential financing that had made the capital structure more efficient than it would have been if Meridian had said yes. She had been building the best deal she could. She had kept building it through 5 rejections. On the 6th approach, she had been in the right building. Her next deal was already under letter of intent. $62 million. 7 properties across 2 markets, larger and more complex than the last, the kind of transaction she had been working toward for the better part of a decade. She had 3 lenders who wanted it, not because the landscape had changed overnight, but because the $30 million deal had done what deals do when they perform. It had circulated through the industry's informal conversation as an example of exactly the kind of transaction that rewarded lenders who understood it. David Park had already called about it, so had 2 others she had approached before, who had declined to finance the last one and who had not forgotten that she had noted their declination and gone across the street. She did not return those calls immediately. She let them sit for 3 days. Not as a power move. She had no interest in power moves, but because the calls being made at all was information, and she wanted to hold the information long enough to understand what it was telling her before she responded to it. What it was telling her was simple. The work was speaking now in the only language the industry reliably heard. She started the car. She had a 2:30 appointment with the first of the 3 lenders in an office building 6 blocks from where she was parked and 4 blocks from Meridian Bank and directly across from the building where the $30 million deal had closed. She was not early. She was not late. She had learned in 26 years that the best thing you could be on the way to a meeting that was going to go well was exactly on time, present, prepared, unhurried, carrying exactly what the deal required and nothing extra. She had the package in the back seat. She had the structure in her head. She had 26 years of knowing what she was doing and a deal that showed it. She pulled out of the parking lot. She had work to do.